If you're a senior driver, or you're helping a parent or spouse stay independent behind the wheel, there is something important changing in 2026 that you need to understand. Most people think the biggest threat to an older driver's license is simply getting older. They imagine a mandatory road test, an age cutoff, or a new federal rule that suddenly takes licenses away after a certain birthday, but that is not what is happening. The reality is more complicated and, in some ways, more encouraging. There is no new federal law taking driver's licenses away from everyone over 70. There is no nationwide senior road test, and there is no single age at which Washington automatically revokes your license. Driver licensing is handled by individual states, which means the rules can change depending on where you live. And that matters because several states are quietly changing how older drivers renew their licenses, how vision requirements work, how frequently seniors have to appear in person, and how medical concerns can trigger a review. One of the biggest changes actually makes things easier for hundreds of thousands of older drivers. But another change creates a completely different kind of risk. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. You may not lose your license because you failed a driving test. You could find yourself in trouble because you missed a letter, overlooked a deadline, or didn't realize that someone had formally raised a concern about your ability to drive. So today, we're going to separate what is actually changing from what is simply circulating online, explain the 5 major areas seniors need to watch, and most importantly, show you what you can do now to protect your driving privileges and your independence. Because once you understand how these rules actually work, you may realize that the biggest risk isn't your age at all, it's being unprepared. Let's start with the change that received the most attention. For years, Illinois stood out because it required drivers to take an actual behind-the-wheel road test based solely on age. According to the source material, that requirement previously began at age 79. But beginning July 1, 2026, the age threshold moved from 79 to 87. That is a major change for older drivers in the state. The source estimates that roughly 350,000 Illinois drivers fall within that age range, while approximately 55,000 were previously being sent for road tests each year. And there is an important reason this changed. The state's transportation data reportedly showed that drivers age 75 and older had a lower crash rate than every age group between 16 and 74. In other words, the people being singled out for additional age-based testing were not necessarily the people presenting the greatest statistical risk. The legislation passed unanimously, and that tells us something bigger about the direction of senior driver policy. For decades, age was used as a convenient proxy for risk. You reach a certain birthday, and the state assumes that additional testing may be appropriate. But age doesn't tell the entire story. 2 people can both be 82 and have completely different driving abilities. One may have excellent vision, strong reaction time, and decades of safe driving experience. Another may have health or cognitive issues that genuinely affect driving. So the policy question becomes much more precise. Should the state judge someone because of their birthday? Or should it focus on actual evidence that a particular driver may have difficulty operating a vehicle safely? Illinois appears to be moving toward the second approach, but there is an important detail. The elimination of the age-triggered road test does not mean older drivers have unlimited renewals. According to the source, drivers between 79 and 80 renew every 4 years in person with a vision test. Drivers between 81 and 86 renew every 2 years in person, again with a vision test. And beginning at 87, the annual in-person renewal and road test requirements return. There is also a transition issue. If a license expired before July 1, 2026, the old rule applied. The change was not retroactive. That is an important distinction because a headline saying Illinois eliminates senior road tests can create the wrong impression. The real story is more specific. The age threshold changed. The licensing system did not disappear. And that brings us to the second change, which may ultimately matter more for some families. The same Illinois law created a formal mechanism for immediate family members to report concerns about a driver's medical condition, cognitive changes, or vision problems. The concern can then be reviewed by a medical board, which may require the driver to provide medical documentation within a specified period, such as 30 days. Now, this needs to be understood carefully. This is not a rule saying that family members can simply take away someone's license. It is a mechanism for triggering a formal review, and there is a reasonable argument for why such a mechanism exists. A family may notice a problem before a crash occurs. A son or daughter may see a parent struggling with vision, becoming confused, or having difficulty with situations that once seemed routine. The goal is supposed to be identifying genuine safety concerns before something serious happens. But there is a trade-off. An age-based rule is predictable. You know your birthday. You know when the test is coming. You can prepare. A complaint or referral is different. It can happen at any time, and the first indication may be a letter from the state. That changes the nature of the risk. Imagine an older driver with decades of clean driving history, no recent tickets, no major accidents, no reason to believe that a government agency is about to contact them. Then one day, an official envelope arrives. The envelope may look completely ordinary. There may be no giant warning on the outside, but inside could be a deadline requiring action. This is why administrative awareness becomes so important. The issue isn't simply whether you can drive, it's whether you understand what your state requires you to do when a formal review begins. And that brings us to the third major area, vision. Vision requirements are not uniform across America. According to the source material, roughly 19 states have vision requirements specifically affecting older drivers, but the age at which those requirements begin varies significantly. Some states introduce additional vision requirements in the mid-60s. Others don't trigger them until much later. And some states do not require vision testing at renewal at any age. That variation is important because there is no single national rule you can memorize. Your neighbor's experience may have nothing to do with your own. Your brother in another state may be able to renew online while you have to appear in person. A friend may have to complete a vision test at 70 while your state doesn't require one until 80. So the question isn't, what is the senior driving law? The better question is, what does my state require at my age? And there is one practical step that can make this much easier. Don't wait until renewal day to discover whether your vision is good enough for the state's minimum standard. Have your eyes checked ahead of time. If you already use glasses or contacts, bring them. If you recently had cataract surgery or another eye procedure, ask your doctor specifically about driving and the timing of any required testing. And if your state permits an eye doctor to submit a vision report electronically, ask whether that option is available to you. In some states, completing the vision documentation through your eye care provider may reduce or eliminate the need for an additional trip to the licensing office. That is the kind of small administrative detail that can save an older driver an unnecessary appointment. But there is another point that deserves attention. A vision problem doesn't automatically mean you are finished driving. Depending on the state's process and the circumstances, the outcome could be a renewal, a corrective lens restriction, additional medical documentation, another test, or a more comprehensive end review. A requirement to wear corrective lenses while driving is not necessarily a punishment. It can simply reflect the reality that the driver needs glasses to meet the legal vision standard. The important thing is to address problems early, rather than discovering them during a rushed renewal appointment. Now we get to the fourth change. And this one is less dramatic but potentially more disruptive. As people get older, the renewal period can become shorter. When you're younger, you might have a license that lasts 8 or even 10 years. You renew it once, put the card back in your wallet, and forget about the entire process. But in some states, older drivers have shorter renewal cycles. That can mean more frequent vision tests, more frequent visits to licensing offices, and more. Opportunities for an administrative deadline to slip past you. The source material gives examples including Missouri shortening the cycle at age 70, Indiana moving to a 2-year cycle at 85, Illinois requiring more frequent renewal at advanced ages, and Florida shortening the renewal period at 80. It also notes that several states restrict online or mail renewal for older drivers. Again, the exact rule depends on the state, but the broader lesson is universal. A shorter renewal period means you have less room for forgetting, and this is where a seemingly harmless administrative mistake can become a much larger problem. Imagine you've renewed online for years. You know exactly how the website works. You assume your next renewal will be identical. Then you reach a certain age and the online option disappears. You try the website. It doesn't work. You assume there's a technical problem. You tell yourself you'll try again next week. Then another week passes. Suddenly, the license has expired. Nothing about the driver's ability changed. The administrative process changed, and that distinction matters. A valid license is not something you should treat as permanent simply because you've had one for decades. So instead of waiting for the expiration date, work backward. Give yourself roughly 60 days. Use that time to determine whether you need an appointment, whether you need a vision exam, whether your documents are current, and whether your state has changed the renewal method. That 60-day cushion can turn a stressful emergency into a normal errand. And there's another administrative detail that people often underestimate: documentation. Your address needs to be current. Your name and identification documents may need to match. If your state requires additional identity documentation, you may need to locate a birth certificate, marriage certificate, or another official record. None of those things is especially complicated. But finding an old document when you have 3 days left before expiration can be surprisingly difficult. That is why preparation matters. And now we reach the 5th change, and this is where the stakes become more serious. Medical review. Nearly every state has some version of a process that allows authorities to investigate concerns about a driver's medical fitness. The exact terminology and procedure vary. A concern might originate with a doctor, law enforcement, or in some states, a family member. The state may then request additional information or testing. That could involve a vision examination, written test, road test, medical evaluation, or some combination. But here's the part you need to remember. If you receive an official notice requiring action, the deadline matters. You could have a completely clean driving record and still face consequences if you simply ignore the notice. That is why the mailbox has become part of the driving safety conversation. A person can be a responsible driver and still make an administrative mistake. A letter gets placed on the kitchen counter. Another piece of mail gets put on top. The deadline passes. The second notice arrives. Now the problem is no longer simply answering a request. It may involve dealing with a suspension or another formal action. This is where most people get caught. Not necessarily on the road, at the mailbox. And the financial consequences can extend beyond the license itself. If someone suddenly cannot drive, transportation becomes a household expense. Medical appointments still happen, groceries still have to be purchased, prescriptions still have to be collected, family members may have to rearrange work schedules. A few rides here and there may not seem significant, but over several months, those costs can add up. And that brings us to a broader distinction. There are 2 ways households tend to handle these changes. The reactive household waits for the renewal notice. They discover the rules have changed when the old process stops working. They search for documents at the last minute. They discover a vision requirement during the appointment. They open government mail when they get around to it. And they deal with problems after they happen. The strategic household operates differently. They know the expiration date. They check their state's rules before renewal. They maintain their documents. They keep their address current. They schedule vision appointments proactively. And most importantly, they treat correspondence from the licensing agency as time-sensitive until they know otherwise. The difference between these 2 households isn't necessarily intelligence, it is preparation, and that distinction becomes more important as renewal periods get shorter and requirements become more individualized. If you're watching this and you're 60, 70, 80, or older, here's what this means for you personally. First, don't assume that getting older automatically means losing your license. That is not the message. Second, don't assume that your state will follow the same rules as the state where your friend or relative lives. It may not pay. Third, don't assume that the process you've used for the last 20 years will still be available at your next renewal. It might have changed. And fourth, don't ignore a letter simply because you've never received one like it before. That is precisely why it deserves attention. The goal here isn't to create fear, it's to replace uncertainty with preparation. So what can you actually do this week? Start by taking your driver's license out of your wallet. Look at the expiration date. Put that date somewhere you will actually see it, and then put a reminder on your calendar well before the expiration date. Next, visit your state's official licensing website and check 3 things. Find out when vision testing applies to your age. Find out whether you can renew online or by mail. And find out how long your next license will be valid. Then call your eye doctor. Ask whether they can complete whatever vision documentation your state uses for license renewal, and whether they can submit it electronically if your state allows that. Then check your address. Make sure the licensing agency has your current mailing address. Finally, make one simple household rule. Any letter from your state's driver licensing agency gets opened the day it arrives. Not next weekend, not when you have time, that day, because you don't need to memorize every rule in your state. You just need to make sure that when a rule applies to you, you don't miss the notice explaining what you need to do. And there is one more conversation that families should have. If you're an older driver and your son or daughter has expressed concerns about your driving, don't automatically treat that conversation as an attack on your independence. Sometimes it is a warning, sometimes the concern may be misplaced. But either way, an honest conversation can be much easier than waiting until a formal process begins. And if you're the adult child, remember that raising a concern doesn't have to mean immediately turning to a government process. If there is a genuine safety concern, formal reporting may sometimes be appropriate. But whenever possible, start with the conversation. Can your parent get a vision exam? Should they avoid driving at night? Would a medical appointment clarify something? Could another family member ride with them and observe? The objective shouldn't be to win an argument about driving. The objective should be to preserve safety and as much independence as possible. And that brings us to the bigger picture. The most important shift happening here isn't simply about senior drivers. It's about how governments are trying to distinguish between age and actual ability. An 85-year-old isn't automatically an unsafe driver, and a 60-year-old isn't automatically a safe one. Age can be relevant, but age alone doesn't tell the entire story. The more individualized approach can be fairer. It can prevent capable older drivers from being subjected to unnecessary testing simply because they crossed an arbitrary age threshold. But it also means drivers and families need to understand the systems that can trigger a review. The old system was easier to predict. Your birthday told you when something was coming. The newer approach can be more individualized, but individualized systems require more awareness. That is the trade-off. And if you remember nothing else from this video, remember this. Your driver's license is not just a plastic card. For many older Americans, it represents mobility, access to healthcare, groceries, family, work, community, and independence. That is why a few minutes of preparation can have an outsized impact. Check the expiration date, know your state's requirements, prepare your vision documentation, keep your address current, and open official licensing mail immediately. These aren't dramatic steps. They aren't complicated, but they create a margin of safety, and margins matter. The households that stay financially and practically stable over the long term are rarely the ones that predict every change perfectly. They're the ones that notice changes early enough to respond calmly. So don't panic about headlines claiming that seniors are suddenly losing their licenses nationwide. That's not what the source material supports. Instead, understand what is actually changing in your state. Understand what could trigger a review, and prepare before the deadline arrives. Because the difference between a difficult situation and a manageable one is often not the rule itself. It's whether you knew the rule was coming. If you're a senior driver, or you're helping an older parent or relative, I'd like to know what the renewal, the process looks like where you live. Have the rules in your state become easier, more complicated, or more frequent in recent years? Share your experience in the comments. And if you want more calm, practical explanations of the rules that can affect retirement, household, finances, and everyday independence, consider subscribing. The goal isn't to make you worry about every change. It's to make sure the changes you need to know about don't catch you by surprise.